Hello, and welcome to Lore and Sleep. Tonight we travel to the oldest civilization the Western world has ever known, to a land so ancient that when the Greeks first visited it and stood before its monuments, they felt themselves to be in the presence of something that made their own history seem recent, almost new. We are going to Egypt, not the Egypt of guidebooks or documentaries, but the living Egypt, the Egypt that stretched across 3,000 years of continuous civilization along the banks of a single great river, building and praying and farming and burying its dead in tombs so magnificent that 2,000 years of decay have not diminished them. This is the story of ancient Egypt, of the pharaohs who were gods, and the gods who were animals, and the river that was both a road and a religion, of the workers who built the pyramids in the desert heat, and the priests who kept the sacred fires burning, and the farmers who watched the river rise every year and understood in their bones that everything depended on that rising, of the queens who ruled empires, and the scribes who recorded everything, and the ordinary people who lived their lives between the desert and the river in one of the most extraordinary landscapes the world has ever produced. It is a story that belongs to the night. Egypt built its greatest monuments to face the rising sun, but it understood the dark perhaps better than any civilization before or since. The Egyptians thought deeply about death, about what comes after, about the journey the soul takes through the night toward whatever morning awaits it. They were people who looked at darkness and saw not an ending but a passage, and that understanding, 3,000 years old and still somehow resonant, makes their story perfect for this hour. If these journeys bring you calm, I invite you to like this video, subscribe to the channel, or leave a quiet thought in the comments below. It helps others find their way here, one sleepy soul at a time. But for now, there is nothing you need to do. Let your body grow heavy. Let your breathing slow. Let the river come to you, wide and dark and ancient, carrying everything it has always carried toward the sea. Let us begin. Everything in ancient Egypt begins with the river, not with the pharaohs or the pyramids or the gods or the great temples, but with the water, the long dark water that comes down from the mountains of Central Africa and moves northward through 1,000 miles of desert before emptying into the Mediterranean Sea. The Nile was not simply a river to the ancient Egyptians. It was the reason Egypt existed at all. Without it, there would have been no civilization in that place, only desert, two vast reaches of sand and rock, stretching east and west from a barren valley, uninhabitable and silent. The Greek historian Herodotus, who visited Egypt in the 5th century before the Common Era, and wrote about it with the particular mixture of admiration and bafflement that Egypt has always inspired in foreigners, said that Egypt was the gift of the Nile. And in this, he was more right than he perhaps knew. The Nile gave Egypt its food, its water, its building materials, its trade routes, and its calendar. It gave Egypt its understanding of time, which was cyclical rather than linear, organized around the rhythms of a river that rose and fell with the precision of a natural clock. And it gave Egypt, perhaps most importantly, its understanding of renewal, the idea that death is not an ending, but a preparation for a return, that what disappears underground in the darkness comes back again when the time is right. The annual flood of the Nile was the central event of the Egyptian year. Every summer, fed by the monsoon rains that fell far to the south in the Ethiopian highlands, the river rose, slowly at first, and then with increasing speed, spreading out across the flat valley floor and depositing the black silt that made the soil of Egypt among the most fertile in the ancient world. The Egyptians called this black soil Kemet, the Black Land, and they called their country by the same name, Kemet, the Black Land, as opposed to the desert on either side, which they called Deshret, the Red Land, the place of death and chaos and everything that was not Egypt. The flood came and covered the fields and left its gift of silt and then retreated, and the farmers who had waited on the higher ground during the inundation came back down to the black earth and planted their seeds. And by the time the next flood came, the crops had been grown and harvested and stored against the year. This cycle, inundation and planting and harvest and inundation again, organized Egyptian life for 3,000 years with a regularity that no other agricultural civilization in the ancient world could match. The Nile was predictable in a way that the rivers of Mesopotamia, which flooded unpredictably and sometimes catastrophically, were not, and this predictability gave Egypt a stability and a continuity that was the foundation of everything else. The Egyptians divided their year into 3 seasons based on the Nile. Akhet was the season of inundation, when the river was high and the fields were underwater. Pere was the season of planting and growth, when the water had receded and the black soil was ready for seeds. Shemu was the season of harvest, when the crops were gathered before the river began to rise again. Each season lasted 4 months, and together they made a year of 12 months, each of 30 days, with 5 extra days added at the end to make up the difference. It was a calendar of remarkable precision for its time, and it served Egypt well for centuries. The Nile was also a road, the highway that connected the long, narrow country from the first cataract in the south at the border of what is now Sudan to the wide-spreading delta in the north, where the river fans out into multiple channels before reaching the sea. Boats moved up and down the river constantly, carrying grain and stone and cattle and people and the goods of trade from one end of the country to the other. The prevailing wind in Egypt blows from the north, which meant that boats could sail south against the current using their sails and drift north with the current when they wished to return. And the Egyptians came to understand this convenience as a gift from the gods, the perfect arrangement of wind and water that made their country not just habitable, but navigable in both directions simultaneously. The geography of Egypt was also its defense. The desert on both sides of the Nile Valley was not just empty land, but a natural barrier that made invasion extremely difficult, because any army that wished to attack Egypt had to cross vast stretches of waterless wasteland before it could reach the fertile valley. To the north, the Mediterranean Sea provided another barrier, and to the east and northeast, the Sinai Peninsula, while not impassable, was a difficult route that gave Egypt advance warning of approaching enemies. This natural protection meant that Egypt was far more secure than most ancient civilizations, and that security allowed Egyptian culture to develop at its own pace with less disruption from outside than most ancient states experienced. The people who settled in this extraordinary landscape in the millennia before what we call historical time developed gradually and through a process that archaeology has been slowly uncovering for the past 2 centuries, a culture that was distinct from anything else in the ancient world. They buried their dead in the desert, where the dry sand preserved bodies in ways that made mummification when it was later developed, seemed like a natural extension of what the earth itself was already doing. They traded with their neighbors to the south and east and north, and gradually developed a writing system, one of the earliest in the world, that allowed them to record their transactions and their stories and their prayers, and eventually the full extraordinary complexity of a civilization that would last with remarkable continuity for 3,000 years. The unification of Upper and Lower Egypt, the two distinct regions of the country, the narrow Nile Valley of the south and the wide flat delta of the north, into a single kingdom under a single ruler, is traditionally dated to around 3,100 before the Common Era, and is associated with a king whose name is given in later sources as Menes, though the historical details of this unification are still debated by scholars. What is not debated is that it happened, and that the unified Egypt that emerged from it became one of the most powerful and most enduring states the ancient world would ever produce. The symbol of this unification was the double crown, the red crown of Lower Egypt, combined with the white crown of Upper Egypt into a single headdress worn by the pharaoh, the king who ruled both lands. It was a symbol that said, in the clearest visual language, that the two halves of this country belong together, that the person wearing this crown holds them both, that the division has been healed and the wholeness restored. Egyptian kings would wear this double crown for 3,000 years, an emblem of unity that outlasted every dynasty that used it. The ancient Egyptians were among the most religious people who ever lived, which is saying something, because almost every people who has ever lived has been deeply religious in one way or another. But the Egyptians had a relationship with their gods that was particularly intense and particularly physical, a sense that the divine was not remote or abstract, but immediately present in every aspect of the natural world, in the river and the sun and the animals and the stars and the regular passage of the seasons. Their gods were not distant beings who had created the world and then stepped back to observe it. They were the world, or at least the forces that kept it running, and their proper functioning was not something that could be taken for granted, but something that had to be actively maintained through ritual and prayer and offering, and the careful observation of the sacred laws that kept chaos at bay. The Egyptian pantheon was vast and complex and, to outside eyes, somewhat bewildering in its multiplicity. There were hundreds of gods, each associated with particular natural phenomena or human activities or places, and many of them were depicted with animal heads on human bodies, which was the Egyptians' way of representing the divine forces they saw operating in the natural world. Ra, or Re, was the sun god, the most important of all the Egyptian deities, who sailed across the sky in his solar bark during the day and journeyed through the underworld at night, fighting off the forces of chaos that threatened to prevent his rising each morning. His successful passage through the night and his return at dawn was the fundamental miracle on which all of existence depended, the first and most basic triumph of order over chaos that was reenacted every day since the beginning of time. Osiris was the god of the dead and of resurrection, the divine king who had been murdered by his brother Set and brought back to life by his wife Isis, and who now ruled the kingdom of the dead from his throne in the underworld. His story was the central myth of Egyptian religion, the template for the royal ideology that held that every pharaoh was Horus in life and Osiris in death. That kingship was both divine and cyclical, that the ruler who died became one with the god of the dead, and the ruler who succeeded him became the living Horus, son of Osiris, son of the dead king. This equation between royalty and divinity was the keystone of the Egyptian political system for 3,000 years. The idea that made the pharaoh not just a ruler, but a god, and therefore not just powerful, but cosmically necessary. Isis was the great mother goddess, the devoted wife of Osiris and the loving mother of Horus, and she was in many ways the most human of the Egyptian deities, the one whose emotions were most accessible to the ordinary person, whose love for her husband and her child gave her a dimension of feeling that the more abstract cosmic deities sometimes lacked. She was also one of the most powerful magicians in the Egyptian pantheon, whose skill in the magical arts had enabled her to bring Osiris back from the dead and to protect the infant Horus from the dangers that surrounded him. She was worshipped across Egypt for thousands of years, and her cult eventually spread throughout the Roman world, making her one of the most widely venerated deities of antiquity. Set was the god of chaos and storms, and the desert, the murderer of Osiris and the rival of Horus, and he occupied a complicated position in Egyptian religion that was neither purely evil nor purely good. The desert, which Set represented, was a place of death and danger, but it was also a place of power, and Set's strength was real and sometimes necessary. In the myth of the sun god's nightly journey through the underworld, it was Set who fought off the serpent Apophis, the great serpent of chaos that threatened to swallow the solar bark and prevent the sun from rising. The Egyptians were sophisticated enough in their religious thinking to understand that what they feared could also be useful, that the force of destruction could be directed toward protective ends. Horus was the falcon-headed sky god, the son of Osiris and Isis, the living embodiment of divine kingship, and the left and right eyes of Horus were the sun and the moon, which meant that the sky itself was Horus's face, looking down on the world from above. The pharaoh was Horus on earth, the divine king whose rule maintained the cosmic order, and when the pharaoh died, he became Osiris, joining his divine father in the underworld and passing his Horus nature to his successor. This was not metaphor for the ancient Egyptians, it was theology, the literal explanation of how the universe worked and why kingship was sacred. Thoth was the god of wisdom and writing, and the moon, depicted as an ibis-headed figure, or sometimes as a baboon, who had invented hieroglyphic writing and who served as the scribe of the gods, recording the judgments of the divine court and the deeds of human beings. He was the patron of scribes and scholars and all those who worked with words and numbers, and his temple at Hermopolis was one of the great centers of learning in the ancient world. The ibis, that long-beaked wading bird that was common along the Nile, was sacred to Thoth, and thousands of ibises were mummified and offered to him as votive gifts over the centuries, a practice that strikes modern observers as curious, but that was, for the Egyptians, a completely natural expression of devotion. Anubis was the jackal-headed god of embalming and the guardian of the dead, who presided over the process of mummification and guided the souls of the newly dead through the first stages of their journey to the afterlife. The jackal was associated with death and burial in Egypt because jackals were often seen near cemeteries, drawn by the scent of the dead, and the Egyptians, with their characteristic tendency to find the divine in the natural world, had made the jackal the guardian of the places it haunted, Anubis was a presence of protection rather than threat, a comforting figure who ensured that the dead were properly prepared for their journey and properly guided through the unfamiliar territory of the beyond. The concept that held all of these divine forces together was Ma'at, which meant truth and justice and cosmic order, and which was personified as a goddess wearing a single ostrich feather in her hair, the feather against which the heart of the dead was weighed in the judgment hall of Osiris. Ma'at was not just a goddess, but an idea, the fundamental principle that organized the universe, the proper relationship between all things, the balance and harmony that kept chaos from overwhelming order. The pharaoh's primary duty was to maintain Ma'at, to keep the cosmic order intact through right action and right governance, and the proper performance of religious ritual. A pharaoh who maintained Ma'at was fulfilling the divine purpose of kingship. A pharaoh who violated it was threatening the stability of the cosmos itself. The word pharaoh comes from the Egyptian per-ai, meaning the great house, and it originally referred to the royal palace rather than to the king himself. Over time, as so often happens with titles of address, the term migrated from the institution to the person, and by the middle period of Egyptian history, it was being used to refer to the king directly. The pharaoh was not merely a ruler in the political sense that we understand today. He was a divine being in human form, the living link between the human world and the divine world, the person through whom the gods acted on earth and through whom human beings communicated with the gods. The titles that the pharaoh bore accumulated over the centuries of Egyptian history into a complex system that expressed different aspects of his divine nature. He was the son of Ra, emphasizing his connection to the sun god and his role as the solar deity's representative on earth. He was the Horus in his palace, the living god whose presence on the throne maintained the cosmic order. He was the lord of the two lands, ruler of both Upper and Lower Egypt. He was the lord of the two horizons, which connected him to the sun's journey from east to west across the sky. Each title was a theological statement as much as a political one, expressing an understanding of kingship that saw the ruler as the axis around which the universe turned. The first pharaohs of the unified kingdom ruled from Memphis, the city that Menes, or whoever had actually accomplished the unification, had founded at the meeting point between Upper and Lower Egypt, the narrow valley and the wide delta. Memphis was a city of enormous importance throughout Egyptian history, the administrative capital from which the country was governed, the site of some of Egypt's most ancient temples, and the location of the necropolis of Saqqara, where the earliest royal tombs were built, and where the step pyramid of Djoser still stands, the oldest large stone monument in the world, a building that was already ancient when the Great Pyramids of Giza were being planned. Djoser was a king of the Third Dynasty, ruling around 2600 before the Common Era, and his step pyramid was designed by a man named Imhotep, who is one of the most remarkable figures in the whole long history of ancient Egypt. Imhotep was an architect and a physician and a scholar of extraordinary ability, the man who first conceived the idea of building in stone rather than in the mud brick that had been used for all previous Egyptian construction. He began with what was essentially a large mastaba, a flat-topped rectangular tomb, and then stacked 5 more mastabas of decreasing size on top of it, creating a 6-stepped pyramid that rose to a height of 62 meters and could be seen from miles away across the flat desert. It was the first large-scale stone construction in human history, and it changed everything about what building could mean. The Great Pyramids of Giza, which came 2 or 3 generations after the Step Pyramid, represent the absolute peak of pyramid construction, the most ambitious stone buildings that human beings had yet attempted, and that, in terms of sheer scale and precision, would not be surpassed for thousands of years. The Great Pyramid of Khufu, built around 2560 before the Common Era, contains approximately 2.3 million stone blocks, weighing between 2 and 15 tons each, and it was, for most of human history, the tallest man-made structure in the world. The precision with which it was built is extraordinary. The base of the pyramid is level to within 2 centimeters. The sides are oriented to true north, with an accuracy of less than 1/10 of a degree, and the corner angles are almost perfect right angles. Khufu, who is known to the Greeks as Cheops, is a somewhat mysterious figure. He ruled at the height of what Egyptologists call the Old Kingdom, the first great flowering of Egyptian civilization, and he commissioned the largest building project in the ancient world. And yet almost nothing else is known about him. The only confirmed portrait of Khufu that survives is a small ivory figurine, about 7.5 centimeters tall, found at Abydos in the early 20th century, which seems almost comically disproportionate to the vast stone monument that bears his name. The pyramid speaks of power and resources and organizational ability on a staggering scale, while the man himself has retreated almost entirely into the silence of history, leaving his great stone tomb to represent him to the future. The construction of the pyramids has been the subject of more speculation and more misunderstanding than almost any other topic in the history of archaeology. The ancient Greeks believed they had been built by slaves, a view that persisted for centuries and that has now been largely overturned by archaeological evidence. The workers who built the pyramids were not slaves but paid laborers, organized into crews with names and identities and a degree of pride in their work. We know this because the workers themselves left graffiti on the stones of the pyramids, team names like Friends of Khufu and Drunkards of Menkaure, the kind of names that people give themselves when they are working together and want to express group identity and a certain cheerful irreverence about the monumental task they are performing. The administrative and logistical achievement of building the pyramids was perhaps even more impressive than the physical one. The project required feeding, housing, and organizing a workforce of perhaps 20 or 30,000 people at any given time, supplying them with tools and materials, managing the quarrying and transport of millions of tons of stone, and maintaining the precision of construction over a period of years or decades. It required a bureaucracy of considerable sophistication and an economy capable of generating the surplus that would support such a non-productive enterprise, which says as much about the organizational capacity of Old Kingdom Egypt as it does about the skills of its architects. The Egyptians built for permanence in a way that very few other civilizations have matched. Their word for monument was jihad, which also meant stability and endurance, and their temples and tombs were designed to last not just for years or centuries, but for eternity, because eternity was the relevant timescale when you were building a house for a god or a resting place for a king who had become one. The materials they chose: granite and limestone and sandstone. The techniques they used: the careful fitting of enormous stones without mortar, the orientation of buildings to align with astronomical phenomena. All of this expressed a belief that the physical world and the spiritual world were connected, that a building properly aligned and properly consecrated was not just a building but a part of the cosmic order it was meant to serve. The temples of ancient Egypt were not places of public worship in the way that cathedrals or mosques or synagogues are. They were houses of the gods, palaces in which the divine beings who governed the universe lived in the form of sacred images, attended to by priests in the same way that a royal palace would be attended to by servants. The ordinary Egyptian did not enter the inner sanctuaries of the great temples. Only the pharaoh and the priests had access to the divine presence, and the daily rituals of feeding and clothing and entertaining the divine image were elaborate and precisely prescribed, the cosmic equivalent of the protocol that governed life in any royal court. The temples grew over centuries as each new pharaoh added his own contributions, building new pylons, the great trapezoidal gateways that were the defining feature of Egyptian religious architecture, and new halls and courtyards and sanctuaries, until the great temples of the New Kingdom, like Karnak at Luxor, had become vast complexes covering hundreds of acres, cities of stone, in which thousands of priests performed their duties in buildings that recorded, on every wall and column, the deeds and the devotions of the rulers who had built them. Karnak was added to by pharaoh after pharaoh for nearly 2,000 years, each one contributing to the accumulation of stone and image and inscription that makes it today one of the most extraordinary archaeological sites in the world. The tombs of the pharaohs were the other great category of Egyptian monumental construction, and they evolved over the course of Egyptian history, from the early mastabas through the Pyramid Age, and eventually to the rock-cut tombs of the Valley of the Kings, that hidden valley on the west bank of the Nile at Luxor, where the pharaohs of the New Kingdom had their burial chambers cut deep into the limestone cliffs, hidden from tomb robbers behind blank cliff faces and concealed entrances. The West Bank was the appropriate side for burial in Egyptian thinking because the sun set in the west, and the land of the dead was understood to lie in the direction of the setting sun in the vast necropolis that stretched along the western desert. The Valley of the Kings contains 63 known tombs, some very simple and some extraordinarily elaborate, their walls covered with texts and images from the books of the afterlife that were meant to guide the royal soul through the dangers of the underworld. These texts are among the most remarkable religious documents that have survived from the ancient world, detailed accounts of the journey through the 12 hours of the night, through regions populated by gods and demons and the souls of the blessed dead, each hour presenting its own challenges and its own guardians, all of which had to be navigated successfully if the royal soul was to reach the dawn and be reborn with the rising sun. The contents of these tombs, when they had not been plundered by ancient or modern thieves, were extraordinary. The tomb of Tutankhamun, the boy king who ruled for only about 10 years in the 14th century before the Common Era, and who was of relatively minor historical importance, contained over 5,000 objects of breathtaking quality, including the famous golden death mask that has become perhaps the most recognizable single object from the ancient world. If a minor king's tomb contained such treasures, the imagination boggles at what the tombs of the great pharaohs, Rameses II and Amenhotep III, and the other giants of Egyptian history must have contained before the tomb robbers reached them. The building of the great temples and tombs required a class of specialized craftsmen who lived together in dedicated villages near the sites of their work and who passed their skills from generation to generation. The best documented of these communities is Deir el-Medina, the village of the workers who built the royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings, whose remarkable archive of papyri and ostraca, pottery sherds used for writing, have given us an extraordinarily detailed picture of daily life, work disputes, family matters, legal cases, and religious practice in an ancient Egyptian artisan community. These are ordinary people in the most extraordinary circumstances, skilled workers with their own rich inner lives, worrying about the same things people have always worried about, while spending their days creating some of the most beautiful art the world has ever seen. Between the desert and the river, along the narrow strip of black earth that the Nile's annual gift made habitable, the ordinary people of ancient Egypt lived their lives in the way that ordinary people have always lived, working and worrying and raising children and arguing with neighbors and growing old. Their world was bounded by the river on one side and the desert on the other, and they were defined by the rhythm of the flood and the planting and the harvest in a way that gave their lives a structure and a predictability that was both comforting and confining. The agricultural year was the foundation of everything. Farming families in ancient Egypt grew emmer wheat and barley, the staple grains that fed both people and animals. They grew flax, whose fibers were woven into the linen that was the primary textile of Egypt, the fabric in which the living dressed and the dead were wrapped. They grew papyrus in the marshy areas near the river, a plant of extraordinary versatility that served as building material and boat material and writing material and food, the entire plant useful in one way or another. They raised cattle and sheep and goats and pigs and geese, and they caught fish from the river in nets and traps and on hooks made of bronze. The diet of ordinary Egyptians was dominated by bread and beer, which may sound unpromising, but which were both considerably more nutritious and more varied than those words suggest in a modern context. Egyptian bread came in dozens of varieties, made from different grains with different additives, and Egyptian beer, brewed from fermented grain and flavored with various ingredients, was thick and nutritious and consumed by people of all ages, including children, because it was safer than the river water, which could carry disease. The wealthy ate better, with more meat and more varied food, but even the ordinary Egyptian diet was sufficient to support a healthy population, as the evidence of ancient skeletons has shown. Egyptian society was organized in a clear hierarchy, with the pharaoh at the top and the gods above even him, and the vast majority of the population at the bottom, working the land and producing the agricultural surplus that supported the temples and the palaces and the armies of scribes and officials and priests who administered the most complex bureaucracy in the ancient world. But the hierarchy was not entirely rigid, and social mobility, while limited, was possible, particularly through education and the scribal profession. The scribes were the educated class of ancient Egypt, the people who could read and write in a society where literacy was rare and valuable. They were trained in special schools, attached to temples and palaces, where they learned hieroglyphics and the cursive scripts derived from them, and they spent their careers in the service of the state or the temples, recording the grain inventories and the tax assessments and the legal decisions and the royal decrees that kept the administrative machinery of Egypt functioning. A good scribe with the right connections could rise quite high in the Egyptian hierarchy, and the scribal profession was accordingly prestigious, held up in the literary texts of the period as the ideal career for an ambitious young man. Women in ancient Egypt had a legal status that was, by the standards of the ancient world, remarkably favorable. They could own property, inherit from their parents, bring lawsuits, and enter into contracts independently of their husbands. They could work as weavers and brewers and musicians and professional mourners, and in various other occupations, and in rare cases, they could exercise very high authority indeed, as priestesses and as administrators, and most spectacularly, as pharaohs. The Egyptian view of gender was complex and did not map neatly onto modern categories, and the freedom that Egyptian women enjoyed in legal and economic matters existed alongside social expectations about female behavior that were in many ways quite constraining. But compared to women in ancient Greece or Rome, Egyptian women occupied a position of considerable legal equality. Marriage in ancient Egypt was a practical arrangement that did not require a religious ceremony or legal formalization to be valid. A couple was considered married when they set up a household together, and the practical documents that governed marriage, agreements about property and financial support, were drawn up between the families involved. Divorce was also relatively simple, though it required property settlements that could be quite substantial in the woman's favor, which gave women a degree of financial protection that women in many other ancient societies lacked. Children were valued and loved, as the surviving letters and personal objects of ancient Egypt make abundantly clear, and childhood illness and death, which were common in any pre-modern society, were experienced with the full weight of parental grief. The villages and towns of ancient Egypt were crowded and noisy places built mainly of mud brick that was cheap and easy to make, and that kept out the heat better than stone. Houses in a typical Egyptian village were built close together along narrow streets, with small windows to minimize the entry of the heat and dust that were constants of life in that climate. The flat roofs served as outdoor living space in the cooler parts of the day, and as sleeping areas on hot nights when the relief of an open sky above and a breeze from the river below made the roof the most desirable place in the house. Animals were often housed on the ground floor of multi-story buildings, which was a common arrangement in many ancient cultures, and which had the advantage of providing a degree of warmth in the cooler months. No aspect of ancient Egyptian civilization has captured the modern imagination more completely than the Egyptian understanding of death and what comes after it. The extraordinary lengths to which the Egyptians went to prepare their dead for the afterlife, the elaborate process of mummification, the richly furnished tombs, the complex and beautiful funerary texts, all speak of a people for whom death was not the end of the story, but the beginning of its most important chapter, a transition rather than a termination, a passage through darkness toward a light that was more real and more permanent than anything the physical world could offer. The central Egyptian understanding of the human being was that it was composed of multiple elements that had to be properly managed at death to ensure successful continuation in the afterlife. The physical body was one element, and its preservation through mummification was important because the other spiritual elements of the person needed to be able to return to it. The Ka was the vital force, or double of the person, which continued to exist after death and needed to be fed and sustained by the offerings that the living made to the dead. The Ba was something closer to what we might call the personality or soul, the individual essence of a person, which was represented as a human-headed bird that could fly between the tomb and the afterlife. And the Ak was the effective spirit, the fully realized spiritual being that the deceased became after successfully passing through all the stages of the afterlife journey. Mummification was the physical technology that supported this spiritual understanding, and it developed over centuries from the simple preservation of bodies in the hot desert sand, which happened naturally and which the Egyptians had observed since prehistoric times, into a sophisticated and elaborate process performed by specialist priests who understood both the technical procedures and the religious significance of what they were doing. At its most elaborate, in the New Kingdom and later, the process of mummification took 70 days, during which the body was dried with natron, a naturally occurring salt. The internal organs were removed and stored in canopic jars. The body was treated with resins and oils and wrapped in hundreds of meters of linen bandages, and protective amulets were placed within the wrappings at specific locations on the body to protect the mummy from supernatural dangers. The funerary texts that guided the dead through the afterlife began with the pyramid texts, the oldest religious texts in the world, inscribed on the interior walls of royal pyramids from the 5th dynasty onward. These were spells and prayers and ritual instructions meant to protect the royal dead and guide them through the underworld, and they were reserved exclusively for the pharaoh in the earliest period. Over time, they were democratized, first through the coffin texts that appeared in the Middle Kingdom on the coffins of nobles and wealthy individuals, and then through the Book of the Dead, that collection of spells and illustrations that appeared from the New Kingdom onward, and that was placed in the tombs of anyone who could afford to have a copy made, from wealthy officials to skilled craftsmen. The Book of the Dead, which the Egyptians themselves called the Book of Coming Forth by Day, was not a single fixed text, but a collection of about 200 spells, from which individual copies were compiled according to the resources and preferences of the deceased and their families. The most famous episode in the Book of the Dead is the weighing of the heart, which took place in the Hall of Two Truths before the assembled gods of the dead. The heart of the deceased was placed on a scale and weighed against the feather of Ma'at, the feather of truth and justice. If the heart was heavier than the feather, weighted down by the sins and wrongdoings of a life lived in violation of divine order, it was eaten by a monster called Ammit, a terrifying, composite creature with the head of a crocodile and the forequarters of a lion and the hindquarters of a hippopotamus, and the deceased ceased to exist. The second and final death. If the heart was lighter than or equal to the feather, the deceased was admitted to the field of reeds, the Egyptian paradise, a place of eternal abundance that looked very much like Egypt itself, but without the hardship. This judgment of the dead expressed something deeply characteristic about Egyptian religious thinking, the belief that moral behavior in life had consequences for the soul after death, that the gods were not indifferent to how human beings treated each other, that justice operated across the boundary of death, as well as within the boundary of life. The list of denials that the deceased was supposed to recite before the divine court, the 42 negative confessions, gives us a remarkable window into the ethical concerns of ancient Egyptian society. I have not stolen, I have not killed, I have not cheated in measuring grain, I have not been deaf to righteous speech, I have not caused anyone to weep, I have not made anyone hungry. These are not the confessions of an abstract theological system, but of a society that cared, concretely and practically, about how people treated each other in the daily business of life, the afterlife itself, as the Egyptians imagined it, was a place of extraordinary beauty and abundance, a perfected version of the world they had known in life. The field of reeds and had all the pleasures of the Nile Valley, lush green fields and clear water and gentle breezes, without the pain and labor and loss that accompanied earthly life. The blessed dead lived there in a state of permanent happiness, farming if they chose to, feasting if they chose to, traveling the divine landscapes in boats if they chose to, or sailing with the sun god in his bark, if they had been fortunate enough to achieve that highest of heavenly rewards. It was a vision of paradise that was deeply rooted in the physical world, drawing its imagery from the most beautiful aspects of life along the Nile and projecting them into eternity. The history of ancient Egypt is divided by Egyptologists into a series of kingdoms and intermediate periods, alternating phases of centralized power and cultural achievement with phases of fragmentation and instability. The Old Kingdom produced the Great Pyramids. The Middle Kingdom produced some of the finest literature and art of the entire Egyptian tradition, and the New Kingdom, which began around 1550 before the Common Era and lasted until around 1070, produced the great empire builders, the warrior pharaohs, who extended Egyptian power into Nubia to the south and into the Levant to the northeast, and who built the great temples of Karnak and Luxor and Abu Simbel that still stand as the most impressive surviving monuments of the ancient world. The New Kingdom began with a war of liberation. Egypt, in the period just before the New Kingdom, had been partially occupied by a people the Egyptians called the Hyksos, people of foreign lands, who had entered from the northeast and established a dynasty in the Delta, ruling Lower Egypt, while Egyptian princes in Thebes maintained a subordinate kingdom in the south. The expulsion of the Hyksos by the Theban princes of the 17th and 18th dynasties was one of the great military achievements of Egyptian history, and it left the Egyptians with a new understanding of themselves, a militarism and an expansionist ambition that had not characterized the earlier periods of their civilization. Hatshepsut was one of the great rulers of the early New Kingdom, a woman who served first as regent for her young stepson Thutmose III, and then, in one of the most remarkable political maneuvers of the ancient world, had herself crowned pharaoh in her own right, taking the full titulary of a male king and being depicted in official representations, wearing the double crown and the false beard that were the traditional symbols of pharaonic authority. She ruled Egypt for about 20 years, with considerable success, managing the country's administration, conducting trade expeditions to the distant land of Punt on the Horn of Africa, and building the magnificent mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari on the west bank at Luxor that is still considered one of the architectural masterpieces of the ancient world. After her death, Thutmose III, who had been kept in the background during her long regency and reign, emerged as a military commander of the first rank and spent much of the rest of his reign on campaign in the Levant, conducting 17 campaigns in about 20 years and extending Egyptian power to to its greatest extent in the northeast. He has been called the Napoleon of ancient Egypt, which is a somewhat anachronistic comparison, but captures something of the scale and systematic nature of his military achievements. He also conducted a campaign of erasure against the memory of Hatshepsut, removing her name and image from many of the monuments she had built and reclaiming her achievements as his own, though this campaign was apparently not undertaken until late in his reign, and its motivations remain a subject of scholarly debate. The 18th dynasty, that extraordinary run of capable rulers that began with the expulsion of the Hyksos and continued through Hatshepsut and Thutmose III, and the brilliant diplomatic pharaoh Amenhotep III, came to its most dramatic episode with the reign of Akhenaten, originally named Amenhotep IV, who in the 5th year of his reign did something that no Egyptian pharaoh had ever done before, and that no Egyptian pharaoh would ever do again. He abolished the traditional Egyptian pantheon and declared that there was only one god, the Aten, the disk of the sun, and that he himself was the sole intermediary between the Aten and humanity. Akhenaten moved the capital to a new city he founded in the desert and named Akhetaten, the horizon of the Aten, known today as Amarna, and he prescribed the worship of other gods, particularly Amun, who had been the dominant deity of the new kingdom and whose priests in Thebes had accumulated enormous wealth and power. The religious revolution of Akhenaten has fascinated scholars and general readers alike for over a century, ever since his city and his art were rediscovered in the 19th century, and it has generated an enormous literature of interpretation and speculation. Was he a genuine religious visionary, the first monotheist? Was he a pragmatic politician trying to break the power of the Amun priesthood? Was he a strange and isolated personality whose peculiarities shaped the theology he imposed? The answer is probably some combination of all of these, but the uncertainty itself is part of what makes his reign so compelling. After Akhenaten's death, the religious revolution he had imposed was dismantled, his city was abandoned, and the traditional gods were restored. His successors, including the boy King Tutankhamun, who restored the cult of Amun and moved the capital back to Thebes, systematically erased his name and image from Egyptian monuments in much the way he had erased Amun, as if trying to pretend that the whole episode had never happened. It was an Egyptian pharaoh named Horemheb who most aggressively pursued this policy of erasure, demolishing the temples at Amarna and reusing their stones in his own building projects at Karnak, and it was only the completeness of the erasure that eventually led to Akhenaten being forgotten so thoroughly that his heretical reign was not rediscovered until the 19th century. The 19th dynasty brought Egypt its most celebrated ruler, the pharaoh who, more than any other, has become the face of ancient Egypt in the modern imagination. Ramesses II, known as Ramesses the Great, ruled Egypt for 66 years, from around 1279 to 1213 before the Common Era, and left his mark on the landscape of Egypt in a way that no other pharaoh before or after quite matched. He built on a scale that even his great predecessors had not attempted, adding to Karnak and Luxor, building his mortuary temple, the Ramesseum at Thebes, and constructing the magnificent temples at Abu Simbel in Nubia, where 2 temples cut from the living rock, their facades dominated by 4 colossal seated statues of Ramesses himself, each 20 meters tall, face the rising sun across the Nile, Ramesses was also a warrior and a diplomat of considerable ability, whose long reign encompassed some of the most significant military and political events of the Late Bronze Age. His most famous military engagement was the Battle of Kadesh, fought against the Hittite Empire in what is now Syria around 1274, a battle that both sides claimed as a victory and that resulted in one of the earliest surviving peace treaties in history, a document that still exists in copies both from Egypt and from the Hittite archives, a rare glimpse of the diplomatic world of the Bronze Age. Ramesses had many wives and many children, his progeny numbering in the dozens if not the hundreds by some accounts, and he outlived many of his sons and successors before finally dying at an advanced age, possibly in his 90s, a remarkable longevity for any period of history. The end of the New Kingdom around 1070, before the Common Era, was followed by a long period of fragmentation and foreign rule, the Third Intermediate Period, in which Egypt was divided between competing dynasties and eventually came under the control of a series of foreign rulers, Libyans and Nubians and Assyrians, each of whom in their turn adopted the pharaonic tradition and presented themselves as legitimate Egyptian kings. Wearing the double crown and making offerings to the Egyptian gods in the time-honored way, the durability and prestige of Egyptian civilization was such that even foreign conquerors wanted to wrap themselves in it to claim its legitimacy, rather than to displace it. The Nubian pharaohs of the 25th dynasty, who ruled Egypt from their capital at Napata in what is now Sudan, were perhaps the most devoted of these foreign adopters, embracing Egyptian religious tradition with an enthusiasm that sometimes outpaced the Egyptians themselves, building pyramids in Nubia long after the Pyramid Age had ended in Egypt, and reviving artistic styles and religious practices from Egypt's most ancient past as a way of establishing their credentials as legitimate rulers of the Black Land. They were ultimately expelled by the Assyrians, who sacked the great temple city of Thebes, an act of destruction that shocked the ancient world. But the Nubian pharaonic tradition continued in the kingdoms of Kush and Meroe for centuries afterward. The late period of Egyptian history brought a series of native dynasties that attempted, with varying success, to maintain Egyptian independence in the face of the great powers of the Near East, Assyria and Babylon and Persia. The Persians conquered Egypt in 525 before the Common Era under Cambyses II, and Egypt became a province of the Persian Empire, though the Persians, like the Nubians before them, largely adopted the pharaonic tradition rather than dismantling it. There were periods of native Egyptian rule in the late period, some of them producing remarkable cultural achievements, but the overall trajectory of the period was toward increasing incorporation into the wider political world of the Near East and Eastern Mediterranean. The conquest of Egypt by Alexander the Great in 332 before the Common Era was, paradoxically, one of the events that extended the life of Egyptian civilization rather than ending it. Alexander was welcomed by many Egyptians as a liberator from Persian rule, and he made a point of consulting the oracle of Amun at Siwa Oasis, where he reportedly received confirmation that he was the son of the god, a claim that fit perfectly into the Egyptian ideology of divine kingship, and that he used to cement his legitimacy as ruler of Egypt. After his death, his general Ptolemy took Egypt as his share of the divided empire and founded the Ptolemaic dynasty, a line of Macedonian Greek rulers who adopted the pharaonic tradition as thoroughly as any of their predecessors, building temples in the Egyptian style, worshipping Egyptian gods, and presenting themselves to their Egyptian subjects as legitimate pharaohs. The Ptolemaic period produced some of the greatest achievements in Greco-Egyptian cultural fusion, including the famous Library of Alexandria, that great repository of ancient knowledge that attracted scholars from across the Mediterranean world, and the city of Alexandria itself, which became one of the most cosmopolitan and intellectually vibrant cities in the ancient world. The Ptolemaic rulers were Greek in culture and language at their court, but Egyptian in their public presentation, a split that reflected the complex nature of a society in which two great civilizations had been brought into intimate contact by the accident of conquest. The last of the Ptolemaic rulers was Cleopatra VII, who has become perhaps the most famous person from the ancient world, more famous than any pharaoh, more famous than most Roman emperors, a woman whose name has meant something in every century since her own. She was the first Ptolemaic ruler to actually learn the Egyptian language, which says something about both her unusual intellectual curiosity and the degree to which her predecessors had remained culturally separate from the people they ruled. She was also a skilled politician in a period of extraordinary political danger, who used her relationships with Julius Caesar and then with Mark Antony to try to preserve Egyptian independence in the face of the rising power of Rome. Her failure and her death in 30 BC, along with the death of Mark Antony, ended both the Ptolemaic dynasty and Egyptian independence, and Egypt became a Roman province, the most important province in the empire, the granary that fed the city of Rome. But something of Egypt persisted through all the changes of rulers and religions and languages. The Egyptian religious tradition continued for centuries after the Roman conquest. The last hieroglyphic inscription was not made until the late 4th century of the Common Era, nearly 4,000 years after the first hieroglyphs were written, and the great temples continued to receive visitors and offerings long after the official religion of the empire had become Christianity. The cult of Isis spread throughout the Roman world, reaching as far as Britain and Germany, carrying Egyptian religious sensibility into the very heart of the Western world. Egyptian art and architecture influenced the art and architecture of Greece and Rome, and through them, the entire Western tradition. And the monuments remained. The pyramids, which the ancient Arabs called one of the greatest wonders of the world, were already ancient when Rome was being founded. They had been old when the great philosophers of Greece were writing their dialogues. They were standing when the Bible was being compiled, and when the first Christians were meeting in the catacombs beneath Rome. They have been standing through all the centuries since, through the rise and fall of empires and religions and languages, through the long, slow transformation of the ancient world into the medieval, and the medieval into the modern. They stand today in the desert outside Cairo, visited by millions of tourists every year, larger and more permanent than anything human ambition has produced before or since. The Sphinx watches from its promontory beside the Great Pyramids, carved from a natural limestone outcropping in the form of a recumbent lion with a human head, the face of a king looking eastward toward the rising sun. It is perhaps the oldest monumental sculpture in the world, older than the pyramids of Giza older than almost anything else that survives from the ancient world. It has seen more history pass before its gaze than any other human-made object on Earth, and it has said nothing about any of it, maintaining the silence of stone through all the long millennia of human noise and ambition that have swirled around it. That silence is one of the things that makes ancient Egypt so compelling to the modern imagination. 3,000 years of continuous civilization, of language and art and religion and politics, and yet so much of it is still mysterious, still only partially understood, still capable of surprising the scholars who spend their lives studying it. The hieroglyphic writing that covered every surface of every temple and tomb was completely unreadable for 15 centuries after the last person who understood it died, and it took the accidental discovery of the Rosetta Stone in 1799 and the subsequent work of Jean-François Champollion to unlock it again. Even now, with the ability to read the ancient language, much of what the Egyptians said remains opaque, not because the words are unclear, but because the ideas behind them operate within a worldview so different from our own that translation of culture is sometimes harder than translation of language. What we can say is this: the ancient Egyptians built something that lasted. They built a civilization that endured for 3,000 years, longer than any other in the Western world, and that left behind monuments and texts and images that are still speaking to us, still beautiful, still capable of astonishing us, still somehow present despite the enormous distance of time that separates their world from ours. They understood something about permanence that we have perhaps not fully understood, something about the relationship between the human and the eternal, that their art and architecture and religion all attempt to express, imperfectly because the attempt is always imperfect, but with a conviction and a skill and a grandeur that the passing of millennia has not diminished. The river still flows, the same Nile that reflected the same stars that the ancient Egyptians watched from the same desert still moves northward through the same valley, carrying the same silt, feeding the same black earth. The flood no longer comes, controlled now by the high dam at Aswan, but the river is there, the gift that made Egypt possible, the reason everything in that extraordinary landscape began. Let the desert rest now under the cold stars that have watched it since before the first stone of the first pyramid was laid. Let the Sphinx look east toward its dawn. Let the pharaohs sleep in their deep tombs beneath the valley floor. Let the river move in the darkness, patient and indifferent, and old beyond all imagining. Egypt endures. And so, tonight, And so, we leave the Black Land resting in the darkness of 4,000 years. We walked the banks of the river that made civilization possible in that desert place, and we felt the weight of the flood and the lightness of the harvest and the particular quality of an agricultural life organized around something as reliable and as beautiful as the Nile. We stood before the temples and the pyramids and tried to understand what it means to build for eternity, and we felt in the scale of those stones and the precision of their placement the conviction of people who believed that what they were doing would last. We met the gods, those animal-headed divine forces who kept the universe running according to Ma'at, the cosmic order that was the Egyptians' deepest value and their deepest fear, the thing that had to be maintained at all costs, because without it, there was only chaos and darkness and the hungry mouth of Ammit waiting to swallow the hearts that had not been light enough. We sat with the scribes and the farmers and the craftsmen and the women raising children in mud brick houses along the narrow strip of black earth. And we understood that the extraordinary architecture and the complex religion were built on the foundation of ordinary human lives, lives that were in their daily details not so different from our own. We followed the dead through the weighing of the heart and the 42 denials and the long journey through the 12 hours of the night, and we understood why a civilization that thought so carefully about death also built so beautifully for life, because for the Egyptians, the two were not opposites, but complements. The same story told in two different registers, the story of what a human being is and what a human being deserves. If this journey brought you some calm, you might like the video, or subscribe to the channel, or leave a small, quiet comment below. It helps others find their way here, and every person who finds their way here is one more person sleeping a little more gently tonight. There is another story waiting for you on the screen. You can simply let it play and let the night continue, and let the ancient world keep talking in its old, slow voice. But for now, there is nothing left to follow. The desert is quiet. The river is dark. The stars are very old and very still. Let your jaw unclench. Let your shoulders drop. Let your hands open slowly, the way hands open when the body finally knows it can rest. Let your breathing find its own quiet rhythm, slow and steady, in and out, like the Nile moving through the night toward the sea, like it has always moved, like it will always move, patient and ancient and absolutely sure of where it is going. Sleep well and good night.